Hello, this is MJ Schwab here from sunny Arizona, and yes, I am actually doing this one in the sun. Well, I'm not in the sun, but it's not too late. Little about 20 to 5, and I'm going to go into the Viking Age again, the rating and trading economics of it, and more of a methodology, the historiography of the period and how it was done from the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and then it wasn't covered at all from then until about the 1970s. And then finally, we've got a different idea here in the modern days, where the sagas have come back into vogue on being primary source documents rather than works of fiction. Um, I want to start with the way that things were done, and I think the best work to talk about is 1906. It's a book written by Arthur Middleton Reeves and Rasmus B. Anderson, and I touched upon it a little bit with the last video, but I didn't go into it at all. Um, the book is called In the Norse Discovery of America, and from the chapter Discovery and Colonization of Greenland, I think that is a fascinating look into how things were looked at, how things were researched, and the sagas came heavily into it. And I'll get to the sagas in a moment a little more directly. The last video I didn't get into them as much as I really wanted to because they're very important, as they are really primary source documents. They were written starting around 1230 uh, in Iceland by Snorri Sturluson. And what he did was he wrote the books based off of the old oral traditions, the oral stories, scholar poetry, and the stories of these people. And I think the most interesting books that he wrote were the Icelanders, or the Saga of the Icelanders, and its companion piece is the Greenlander Saga and the Saga of Eric the Red and his sons. It's mostly known by the Saga of Eric the Red. But those two books, the last two that I mentioned, deal heavily with the discovery of America. And that's what Reeves and Anderson talk about, not just the discovery of Greenland, but also the discovery of America. And so they get into that based off of just Snorri Sturluson's work and the interpretations that had happened in the late 1800s, 1880s, and 1890s, which was really the heyday of Viking research in modern America and Scandinavia as well. In fact, it's an Englishman, Reeves, and Anderson's a Norwegian. And so what you have is the Saga of Eric the Red and his sons and the Greenlander Saga. They're essentially the same book. The only thing that's different, and this is what happened with what wound up happening in the 1900s and why the scholarship wanted going away from the sagas, is in the Saga of Eric the Red and his sons, at one point they're having a battle with the Skraelings, that were the Native Americans, probably the Beothuk, but possibly the Micmac, maybe even the Iroquois. It's really unknown, but the origin stories, the stories about the Viking time from the Beothuk claim that they fought with not just them, but the Micmac as well. Micmac was the Beothuk mortal enemy. But and I think that's the reason why that's a perfect example. A catapult was used by the Native Americans, and so and I think a lot of people. It's not that they couldn't have made a catapult, but I think that the researchers who weren't researching the Viking Age took that and other stories like that seemed fanciful, and they went and they decided that the sagas were just fantasy and that they were works of fiction that they shouldn't be dealt with at all. And so Viking research after 1906, after the Reeves Anderson book, was largely just not done until the early 60s when they found Lesam Meadow, and it jived perfectly with the sagas and what all three sagas had said about the discovery of America. So you started not seeing really people going back into the sagas, but you started seeing people write about the economics. Why would the Vikings explore? Why would they settle other areas? And it came down to economics. I think probably the best book on that, or well, this is actually a journal article, but by Advar Hoidel, from the Journal of the Forest History, Volume 24, Number 4. It's from October of 1980, and this is kind of the changeover of the 70s and 80s, where you started looking at this economic aspect. From this section was the Norsemen and the North American forests, and really it's just about the Icelanders, really, in the 1200s and 1300s, while the Greenlander Vikings were still around. They were still, and even into the 1300s and 1400s, the Icelanders were still taking wood from Labrador, which was Markland in the sagas. And so that's an interesting one. And then, of course, from the Journal of Arabic and Islamic Studies, Volume 3, by James E. Montgomery, Ibn Fadlan and the Rusaya. And this talks about the Viking Rus. And this explains not only their economic system, but what they looked like and how they acted. And so that one's really, really interesting. The sagas are interesting because you get this fanciful stuff. Sometimes the stories are even being talked about and they break into Slavic poetry or writing songs, and they're really interesting. And so I understand why researchers, like especially the ones at the Smithsonian, would go away from it. But just because they start telling stories, and I think the poetry is a perfect example. They break away to do that. Well, these were just songs, and they would probably sing by the campfire when they're doing their oral stories. And that's what Snorri Sturluson took, was he eliminated the campfire and the oral talking and the songs and everything like that, and made them poetry, little breaks in the stories, and that's what's really important about it all, is the information that was written besides the songs and the poetry, and so that's why the sagas are important. You need to eliminate some of the fanciful stuff, because that could have been, like, especially from the saga of Eric the Red. These were stories told directly by Eric the Red and his sons, plus the people that were with them. And they probably would have embellished some things. And that's no reason to take the sagas out of the primary source material. And you're starting to see the sagas come back now. Starting in 2015 and 2016, people are really, especially Scandinavians, are starting to take the sagas very, very seriously. And so you're starting to see new research based solely off the sagas and moving away from other things like economics. So, and that's what I hope to do with my later dissertation, is try to find out a little bit more about where these Vikings went, and apply these sagas and these stories to my economic interests of why the Vikings would settle certain areas and explore. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I really appreciate this class for the way the parameters are set up of this class to allow me to do some of this stuff early. And so, anyway, thank you very much.